thanks a lot to Energy team for inviting me. It's a wonderful event. I'm glad to have met some of you, and I'm looking forward to meet the rest of you. So today I wanted to talk about my journey of energy, or like in another way, I wanted to talk about the journey in the Swedish North, because as Federica mentioned, I like hiking, so bear with me while I tell you about the journey of energy. So I want to open with the slides that Al Gore uses for his climate reality training. And here you can see Earth from the moon, and here you can see the atmosphere of our planet. And it's actually a very, very thin layer of gases that surrounds our planet, and that's basically the air we breathe. That's everything that we have to interact in, and that's where we pump tons of CO2. So just to give some background science in climate change. So over the last 800,000 years, the CO2 levels have been varying between about 180 to 280 parts per million. And that's quite perfectly correlating with the temperature on our planet. And actually, when you look at last year, since Industrial Revolution, the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere is reaching 420 parts per million. So that's a huge increase that never happened on our planet before. And that, of course, creates a really, really stressful conditions on our climate. And that you can see, it's not a French flag, by the way. Thanks for someone who mentioned that. You can see in this distribution that before, like in 1950s, 1980s, we had a pretty good spread of the temperature of the days. So some were colder than average, some were hotter than average. And it's a pretty good statistic to take as a background. And then if we look at more recent years, 2005 to 2015, the amount of cooler than average days has actually decreased quite radically. And we see the new event, which is here. It's extremely hot days that have not happened before, and actually now they're quite frequent. They take about almost 15% of all the days. So quite undeniably, climate is changing, and we need to act. So what are the answers? And I guess the first thing that comes to your mind is renewable energy, because that's what we're talking about a lot. But is that the only answer? And I would dare to argue, and listen to me, that's where the journey begins in the Swedish North. And for those who are not Swedish and don't know King's Trail, it's quite a famous hike in northern Sweden. It goes through mountains and valleys. It's a very beautiful land, quite untouched, very remote. And there you can learn quite a lot about the native population of Sweden, the reindeer herders who lived there for thousands of years. And why it's important is that, for example, we take this national park here. I'm not Swedish, so I'm going to butcher the name. It's called Stora Sjöfallet. And if you look at the park boundary, you can actually see that this body of water is excluded from the park. And why is that? So actually, before, in like 1920s, that park was one of the major attractions in the Swedish North, famous for its waterfalls. It had cascades of like many waterfalls going one after another, and it was really stunning, as described by many tourist magazines from that era, and it invited a lot of people to the park. But actually, since the come of more demand for energy, a dam has been constructed. So you can see the dam here, wind turbine, very renewable, but did it do well for the environment? And actually it didn't. So after the dam was built, the river got flooded, of course. Instead of the waterfalls, you see this huge body of water here. And first of all, what happened is that the reindeer herders who live in that area, they usually transport or help reindeer migrate from mountains to the valleys and then to the different mountains. And this huge body of water created a huge obstruction in that path. In addition to that, the hot sun, actually in the Swedish North, the sun shines pretty much 24 hours a day in the summer. So the sun heats up the water that is standing, raises the temperature a few degrees, and these different conditions create the conditions for algae to bloom, and the algae sucks the oxygen out of the air that in turn kills the fish. So the whole ecosystem changes. And that's all because of a dam that was built for electric power plant. And of course, we can look into the situation right now that we have in Sweden. So we have about 11,000 dams, and that's what Sweden is actually famous for. It's a very renewable energy producing country, and many hydroelectric power plants are there in the Swedish North. But out of 11,000 dams, there are only about 2,000 that actually generate electricity. So the other ones are there for some other reasons. And out of these 2,000, only about 200 generate more than 10 megawatt. So a lot of these dams are actually built there over time that got disused or were built for, let's say, having a body of water for cooling for some plant or something like that. And these dams create artificial barriers for fish to migrate, let alone the fact what I was explaining earlier about the change in the ecosystems. So if you look at Sweden, because I live in Sweden right now, so I'm actually very curious what the situation is. Here you can see that only a few rivers, the ones that are blue, have very small impact or no impact from hydroelectric power. So many of the rivers have been changed because of the hydroelectric power. And besides the dams in the rivers, we also have windmills that produce electricity, and that create different set of environmental boundaries and other impacts in the environment. And it all happens in the Swedish North mostly because that's a place that's very abundant in land and not so many people live there. But for those who do, it creates a huge change. So I don't want to be like all negative here and go to the solutions, so what we can do about that. First of all, I think what we need to think about is that building more power plants don't create answers to our problems. The answers are in how we use the energy and how much energy we need. So by changing our ways of life, for example, changing cities, changing the systems, we can greatly reduce the amount of energy that we need. So for example, building rooftop gardens or living in communal living situations, having urban farms, biking to work. There are tons of things that you can do to reduce your carbon footprint, and that actually creates a huge change and takes away these not only coal power plants but also windmills or dams that could actually make a negative impact on the environment. And to give a couple of examples, there is this Lange Eng community in Denmark that's been around for many years, since about 1970s, and it's a very successful example how community living had helped to reduce the impact on the environment by reducing the heating consumption, by reducing water consumption, energy consumption. So that's a huge example of how community living, different systems can help us overcome the mindless consumption of power. Another example is Hurdal Eco Village in Norway. That's a fairly recent development. So it's, again, a small village built in the outskirts of Oslo. And I visited that last year. It's a really, really nice place with very happy people, and actually the sustainable conditions help them to grow their local produce and participate more in the community. So not only does it reduce the impact on the environment, it creates more happiness in those who live there. Besides the communal living, we also, that's where I want to bring our initiatives at Kamos. That's where I work right now. We try to find common ground between architects, city planners, and consulting companies and other actors to create more of these ecosystems. And that's where you can all participate in creating your solutions and creating something, maybe an entrepreneurial venture, or maybe having like a initiative in your company that you're joining to create a better change in the cities. And to go a bit deeper into what we can do and what kind of like entrepreneurial examples we can learn from, I wanted to go a bit deeper into the ethics of new technologies. So I understand that a lot of you are going to start maybe a new entrepreneurial venture, or like you're, I guess, considering what you want to do next. And I think that a lot of you are very bright students or graduates, and you want to create nice things. So thinking about the ethics, how can you decide what kind of ventures are great for environment? So I want to give a few examples from Sweden again. And GodL, this is basically good electricity. It's an alternative to subscription to your electricity provider. And instead of paying for like regular mix of coal, gas, and renewables, you can switch to 100% renewable power. So these guys, GodL, they create an alternative. You pay the same amount or even less for your electricity, but all the electricity is sourced from renewable power. And that helps to show the world that renewable can be also cheaper than coal. Another example is Northvolt, that's been mentioned here many times, but one thing that I guess is a bit less talked about is the circular initiatives at Northvolt. So one example that I got really inspired about is that, for example, when they produce batteries in the production process, there is a lot of salt contaminated with small amounts of cobalt and some other elements. So naturally, what many companies would do is that they would pay someone to take that salt or dump it somewhere and forget about it. But in Northvolt, they actually take away these heavy elements and then use the clean salt for food production or some other uses. So actually, that salt that would otherwise be thrown is now used, and the materials that they take away, they reuse again. So it's a great example of how you can target the different obstacles in the business. Another example is Prometheus. So when I was talking to Falco about what should I talk about, he really got excited about synthetic fuel. And I think that's something that's been around, at least in energy community, like how can we make fuel from air, or how can we use electric power to generate fuel? And it's not science fiction. It's quite, fairly simple process when you know how to do it. So you can absorb CO2 from air and then reduce that CO2 to carbon monoxide. You can also use renewable power to convert hydrogen, to convert water into hydrogen. And then when you have carbon monoxide and hydrogen, it's called syngas or synthesis gas. So these gases, in certain conditions, they react to form hydrocarbons. It's basically high pressure and temperature. And from there, you can make synthetic fuel. And why I brought this example up is that it's very interesting in terms of ethics, because on one hand, you create a really good alternative to fuel, which is made all of renewable power. It's a great alternative to storage, and it's quite clean. But what outcomes can that offer? So you could think that you can replace aviation fuel, which doesn't have an alternative right now, but it can also create a replacement for like internal combustion engine cars, and support the industries that currently build polluting cars to pursue building more polluting cars, and then you don't really know, example, what kind of mix these cars run on. So these things that seem quite small and sometimes in the details are what makes a huge difference in the end. So I want you to keep the open mind and also keep the critical mind to see what examples are good and what examples are not so good for the environment. And in the end, it's all about adventure and having a good time on our planet. So if you think about going back to the journey in the Swedish North, if you want to go out and enjoy the environment and have really good fun, it's not about building more windmills, it's about creating the lifestyle that we really like. So I'd like to thank you for listening, and feel free to find me on LinkedIn if you have deeper questions. But right now, I'm open to questions here as well.
Thank you very, very much, Liudas, for this insight. You put a question mark into our brains. Are sustainable energy solutions really sustainable? It depends on us. So, do you guys have any question for Liudas?
I was interested when you talked about Godel. In Belgium, actually, most energy producers offer the possibility to have 100% renewable energy. But there's kind of a controversy around it, because what they call 100% renewable energy is not really, well, at least not renewable energy that is produced in Belgium. So they basically buy renewable energy certificates on European markets, and then sell it. They put like a green stamp on the electricity that they sell in Belgium. So I was a bit interested in Godel, what makes them special. I mean, I guess in Sweden you have a very high percentage of renewable energy, so it's not such a problem. But do they, for example, sell hydroelectricity that is also produced, like you explained, with hydroelectric dams that do have a quite important environmental impact? And so how do they posture themselves as being better than other producers?
Actually, I love that you brought that up, because all these companies, they have like a bright side and not so bright side. So I think in addition to the fact that sometimes they purchase certifications from other countries, the big problem with these like green subscriptions is that when you buy 100% renewable power, it doesn't mean that when you go home and turn on the heater, it comes from renewable power, because actually they don't change the wires and everything that comes to your house. So that's a big problem in the renewable energy sector. How do we actually provide renewable power to those who want it? Because like with Godel, and I think the same case with the provider that you're mentioning, is that when you pay for the subscription, the amount of energy that you used is produced from renewables, but maybe it's produced sometime at night when you don't use that, and it comes to some like factory or some sort of other consumer. So actually, like that's a great point, that not only we should look into where the energy comes from in terms of geographies, but also how can we achieve more of renewable power in the mix. So I mean, that's a great question. I don't really have the answer how to like make that company or how to improve that company, but I think that we should think about these things, that when we use a certain product, what advantages and what disadvantages does it bring?
I really like that you very clearly said, like, our problem is not building more energy plants. I worked in the energy sector in Mexico for some time, and wind power especially has had a lot of challenges in terms of social impact there. And sometimes it seems that when we talk about energy, we really simplify it to the CO2 emissions. And there's so much more to it. There's biodiversity, there's social impact, there's a lot of equity and just a lot of aspects to it. And sometimes it seems that a lot of the trends for electrification are not necessarily making us greener, but just providing more demand for electricity. And like, I'm more likely now to take maybe an electric Uber than public transport, whereas before maybe I would have just taken the train, in some places.
Right.
So anyway, I guess the question is, do you think, like, it's kind of a very open-ended question, but what do you think, how do you think we can balance like the environmental impact of of energy projects with other aspects? Like, do you think there are like good examples that integrate everything to how we make decisions for our energy system?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think that's a really broad discussion. But I think that things that you mentioned, like taking electric Uber instead of taking the train, is not necessarily a better option. And even before taking the train, maybe we can just bike that distance. So, like, there are different levels of our levels of pollution that we can create, and it comes down to the personal choice and personal selection. And actually, I was having a pretty good discussion just earlier today, like how can we encourage people to make these conscious choices. And I think that what has been brought up, that we don't understand our carbon emissions and we don't understand the actions of what our lifestyle creates in the society, on the planet, to the environment. So one thing that I thought was quite a good idea is perhaps tracking the output that we produce in one day or 1 year. So I think if I remember well, to live in planetary boundaries, one person should produce about 2 tons of CO2 per year. And no one really, not so many people know how much CO2 they produce in a day or in a year. So I think first of all would be to kind of understand better what we produce and how much impact we create. So, and I think then it could come down to the choices of, should I take the electric car or should I bike, or what should I do? Because maybe someone is just making a few hundred kilograms of CO2, although it's very hard to believe because most of us, like, if you fly once, it's already like half of your yearly budget. So it's, I think it comes down to, informing yourself about what impact you create.
Maybe I can propose one platform that exists. I don't know, for those of you who were in the TCD last year in Lisbon, our keynote speaker was the founder of a platform in the US. It's called the Global Footprint Network, and you can actually calculate your footprint, answering some questions, and understanding which activities you are more, let's say, carbon intensive and where you can improve. So Global Footprint Network, I think it's a good starting point. Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry. And do you think that it's better if consumers make those choices, or if we require the companies that are providing these services and products to have that limitation?
I think it would be good to have sane regulation, because I think what I learned, for example, from yesterday's innovation tour here, is that Germany has many laws, and sometimes innovators feel like there is too much regulation. But at the same time, I think regulation is what drives the companies to be more accountable. So a fair amount of regulation can create more impact for the companies to be more green, to pursue green targets. Because if there is no regulation, there's going to be no accountability. And I think that, so just to give you an example, it's very hard to know what your food that you consume, what kind of impact it has. And the companies themselves, only very small portion of the companies have that idea that they want to tell people how much CO2 or what climate impact they have. So on themselves, the companies will rarely go to the lengths to calculate that, but I think they should be the starters, because as an individual, even if I want to calculate what my carbon footprint is or what kind of impact I have, it's very hard. I can maybe calculate the flight impact, but like I said, food is very hard to calculate.
Do you have any other question? Maybe I have a question. How do you evaluate whether you are ethical or not? Do you know if there's some activities going on also on the regulation side to help companies and consumers to evaluate their ethicness?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think that it depends on if you're a consumer or if you're a company. So if you're a company, it's much easier, I would say, because you can track, like I mentioned previously, you can track where your supplies come from, how do you operate, like what kind of operations do you have? Is it like if your company headquarters are spread all over the planet, or is it all localized? So there are things that you can do to measure your impact. If you're a person, you can do quite a lot, but I think it's a bit more limited. So I would say that you can quite easily calculate what impact you have on your travels, for example. So that's quite an easy thing. You can also think about the impact of your diet by like more general numbers. So like if you eat more meat or do you eat more vegetables. I like the statistic that one hamburger is about 2,400 showers. So when you think about it, it's quite a huge number of like quite a big difference between a choice of eating plant-based option or a meat option. So there are these things that you can quite easily do, but then going to deeper length, I think it's still quite hard.
Thank you for the presentation. I wanted to ask if you could tell us a bit about the story of Camos. What are the concepts you're working on, and what do you think brings the biggest impact?
Yeah, absolutely. So Camos is actually a fairly young company. We started last year, and it started with creating more or fostering innovation in Aalto University in Finland. So Camos is actually a funny word. It means darkness in Finnish. It's a Finnish humor. So every cloud has a silver lining, as some people say. So like in the darkness, you can also like shine light on some things, because it kind of represents the darkness on our unknowing of the impact that we have on the planet, or the impact of inefficiencies. So for example, in a lot of governmental operations, for example, healthcare, it wastes so much money, and it could be improved so much by just changing the platform, how it's run. But out of these general ideas, so we started to get contacts with different entrepreneurs and innovators in Aalto University, and it grew to more of a platform where we connect different innovation actors. So sometimes in corporations, sometimes in startups or universities, and as I mentioned as well, cities and architects. So what I mentioned in the presentation was only a part of it. So we also help for startups to find kind of the sustainable path or more ethical ways to do business, as well as grow the business to help with business development. And on the other hand, we help corporations to find these talents that, for example, there's a startup that's doing something with like AI or machine learning to help reduce the energy consumption. And usually, I think that was mentioned even in the presentations earlier, for large corporations to go outside of their comfort zone, outside of their process, is a very, very costly experience. So entrepreneurs and people with innovative ideas are actually those who drive these changes. That's why I said that I really, like, no pressure, but I expect a lot of you to create great initiatives and make change in the world, because people like you have great ideas, you are unbiased by the industry, and I think that in this way, there is so much potential to make the change. And with Kamos, we help people who have great ideas to connect to corporations that want to use these ideas, because I think sometimes the communication is not so good. Thank you.